I'd like to introduce Robert Barrington, who's Director of External Affairs for Transparency International UK, to talk to us about the UK Bribery Act. Thank you, Robert.
Well, the summary of what I'm going to say, if you want to read it now and switch off for an hour or so, is that we do have a tough new law in place. It received royal assent in April last year. It hasn't formally commenced yet. It's expected to commence in June this year, but the government hasn't announced the date yet. It's important to note that it's also happening in other countries, that the UK is not unique in this, that tough bribery legislation has been sweeping the world, and I'll come on to the reason behind that in a minute. The enforcement is also increasing. We all know it's one thing to have laws, but they can sit on the shelf and be ignored for years and years. What's happened in the anti-bribery laws is that the enforcement is increasing quite markedly over the last 5 years or so. Well, the interesting thing about bribes, of course, is that as the laws have got more sophisticated and become enforced better, then the old days of passing over a wad of cash have become less common. And so bribes are often disguised as other things. For example, commission, hospitality and gifts, and I'm sure those will all be resonant phrases in your industry. And part of the challenge is trying to discern what is legitimate commission, gifts and hospitality from what is illegitimate, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. It's very important to note that, of course, those are all entirely legitimate business activities. The problem is, and this is what lawmakers have tried to capture, they are often used also for paying bribes. So lawmakers need to distinguish between the legitimate activities and those which are really bribe-paying, and to try and punish the bribe-paying. Well, now here's the real warning, I think. If you are paying bribes deliberately, then you'd better stop it. Not just because of the UK law, but because of laws around the world. If you don't stop, you risk unlimited fines, both personally and for your company, and 10 years in jail. So I think if you're paying bribes deliberately, stop it. The question I think that will come is, am I paying bribes by mistake, thinking it's a commission, gift or hospitality? And I'm sure we'll cover that. What this means is that companies should be examining their risks, what's their exposure to bribery under the new Act, and putting in place what are called adequate procedures. There is this defence for a company that if it has adequate procedures in place to prevent bribery, then the company itself is not liable if it has a rogue employee who pays a bribe. Okay, well, I'm going to wind back a little bit and ask the question, why are these anti-bribery laws happening all around the world? And the answer is that there are victims of bribery. For many years, I think bribery has been seen as probably a bad thing, but people haven't really understood its impact. And a little bit like fraud, for example, it's has been described as a victimless crime. You know, so what if I pay £10,000 to get a contract? It just helps oil the wheels of commerce. Those kind of arguments have been common. What has been clear in the last probably 20 years or so, from a body of work, partly practical experience of bodies like the World Bank, partly a group of economists who have really looked at this, and partly a group of non-governmental organisations like my own Transparency International, is that the more research has been done into the impacts of bribery, the more it is seen that there are victims of bribery. And legislators have understood that there are victims and want to stop that happening. Just some examples of the victims. I'll pick the middle one here of these examples. A study by Professor Paul Collier, quoted in his book The Bottom Billion, looks at $100 of development aid funding that goes into the health service in Chad to fund rural health clinics. Of that $100 that goes in at the top, $1 comes out at the bottom to fund the rural health clinics. Well, you can immediately see who the victims are, those people in rural Chad who actually need $100 worth of healthcare, and by goodness they need it, and are actually only get $1 worth. Now, that $99 hasn't all disappeared through corruption. Some of it's corruption. The estimates in corruption to do with aid vary from about 10 to 30%, so perhaps $10 to $30 have gone. Some of it's mismanagement, some straight fraud, some ignorance and stupidity, and all those other things that come into play. But certainly a good chunk of that is going in bribery, and you can see instantly who the victims are and why governments are trying to cut down on this. And just to put that in other context, here are a couple of quotes, and you can read them as I talk. The first one points out that as much money comes out of Africa in illegal fund flows as goes in aid. Well, you can instantly see again, that's just a bit stupid. You know, what are we trying to spend this money on? Improving people's lives. And if it's all just coming back and getting laundered through Western bank accounts, then somehow it doesn't stack up. So governments are trying to stop this kind of thing happening, and that's what this legislation is about. Supply-side corruption. It's called supply-side corruption because one of the differences between fraud and corruption and bribery is that in fraud you can have somebody beavering away, fiddling the accounts, and you don't necessarily need somebody to help them. But in bribery, you need two people to make the transaction work. You need the bribe payer and the bribe taker, and the bribe payer is the supply side. So that's what a lot of the legislation in European and northern countries designed to cut off the supply side, and the argument is that you will then cut off part of the problem. Does anybody want to guess at the World Bank estimate of the annual amount of bribes paid around the world? Come on, somebody be brave.
8 billion.
8 billion? You're an optimist, I'm afraid.
20 billion.
20 billion? Another optimist. 100 billion, another optimist. The World Bank estimates that $1 trillion of bribes are paid every year around the world. So you can see from that what may appear, you know, sitting in a hotel in London to be, you know, surely this is marginal or it doesn't really affect economic development, it can't be that big. It is massive. Really big, and you know we've been reading in the papers the last few weeks about the tens of billions of dollars that dictators in North Africa have stashed in bank accounts across the world. Well, that's just the people at the head of a small number of corrupt countries. Imagine magnifying that over many countries and many different peoples in different levels of the administrations and so on. So again, you can see why this legislation is considered necessary. We've at TI done a survey of which countries' companies are most likely to pay bribes. This is a survey just of business people, 2,700 business people, and they say that Mexican, Chinese and Russian companies are the most likely to pay bribes and pay in quite large quantities. Where's the UK on this? Well, it's actually fifth. So we're not squeaky clean by any means. And you can see that from the press coverage of companies like BAE Systems, which recently had a settlement with the Serious Fraud Office. So there's a lot of it going on. It's companies that are often involved. Where are the bribes paid? Well, we do another survey, an opinion survey of citizens in countries, and we ask them, have you had to pay a bribe in the last year? In some countries, over 50% of people say, yes, I had to pay a bribe in the last year. There's a group of countries at the bottom, which includes the UK, which says less than 6% of people in those countries said they had to pay a bribe in the last year. But you'll see, in the middle band, quite a lot of people are saying that, in fact, the majority of countries there say that about 20 to 50% in those countries had to pay a bribe in the last year. So bribe paying is pretty prevalent. Again, it may not seem so from the UK, but this is what the legislation's designed to help stamp out. Who's been caught? Well, there are some really eye-catching fines around now, particularly in the US. Siemens, 1.6 billion, and interestingly also 2.5 billion in legal costs. And what's often said about bribery is, just don't get caught, because it's not just the fines, it's all the collateral damage. Business is almost to the point of collapse because of the additional legal costs and management time and distraction. A company like Siemens can manage that because it's one of the world's biggest companies. For an SME, a small company, a medium-sized company, with this kind of impact, it could be pretty severe on the whole stability and future of that business. The tightening net. The UK Bribery Act is just one of the bits of legislation that's been in place. I've got a few here. The sort of grandfather of them all is the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977. But the really important thing is that there are two international treaties, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and the UN Convention Against Corruption. And that's what the UK law is responding to. We're not compliant at the moment with the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and that's why we have a new law to bring us into compliance with the world norms. The head of the OECD Anti-Bribery Working Group says he thinks the UK law is middle of the road. So there are other countries with stronger laws and other countries with slightly weaker laws, but the point is there are many laws in other countries, and indeed if you're operating internationally at all and you're paying bribes, then you may well be caught not just by the UK law but by the US law and other laws in other jurisdictions. So if you get caught in this, you might find you're fighting legal cases in several different countries at the same time, and that can be extremely complicated for a business. As I mentioned, having the laws is one thing, the enforcement is another. The enforcement has got a lot stricter. I won't go through this in detail, but you can see that now about half of OECD countries are moderately or actively enforcing their laws, and that number is increasing every year.